So recently I was reading Hacker News and I came across something called Internet Object. So today we're going to talk about what it is and why I think you should really care about it if you have any interest in web development. So let's have a look. Good afternoon everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So, if you've done any web development in the past God knows how long, you would know that JSON is the de facto standard for transferring data over the internet, but this hasn't always been the case, and I can guarantee that it won't always be the case. So what Internet Object basically is an alternative to JSON. So, instead of using keys to actually address the data in your document, it uses a schema similar to how a database table would. So, instead of having the keys that you're never actually using for the data, they're just used to get the data out, it makes use of this schema, which ends up cutting out a lot of the useless extra data you don't actually need in the document. So if we switch over my webcam to the correct page, so this is a bit of data in JSON on the Internet Object website. So this same bit of data shown in Internet Object is like this. So as you can see, it is a much smaller bit of data. It's not really a fair comparison because they haven't compressed it, but for the sake of a example, it works well enough. So with Internet Object, because you can also set a schema, you can also mechanically determine if the data is valid, unlike with JSON, where as long as it's within the format of JSON, it's valid, and that leaves it up to the client to actually determine whether that JSON is in the form that it should be in. If you include schemas, then that moves the validation of the data away from the client to the parser, which ends up reducing a bit of the work that the developers will have to do, and I think that's one of the major benefits. So the developer of Internet Object talks about the size differences, and I don't really think that this is really too important. Obviously for certain applications like mobile applications, this may be a serious benefit, but when you look at the size that it is when it is compressed, they are fairly identical. I think that, yeah, here it is. So they are only slightly different when they're compressed, and for anything outside of a mobile application, this really doesn't matter. I think the major benefit with Internet Object comes from this schema, because that's one of the benefits that XML had, but the problem with XML is that it is so wordy and has so much wasted data in it that nobody really feels like using it anymore. I don't like XML myself, but the fact that you can include schemas does really make it easier for the developers to work with. So it's not all perfect with Internet Object. It does have some serious issues, but a lot of these issues can be mainly addressed with time. So the first issue is that JavaScript has default support for JSON because it's the JavaScript object notation, and for very simple apps, this does just make it easier to work with. If I don't have to include an extra library to work with it, it's going to just make it that tiny bit easier. So for a lot of smaller projects, a lot of people will probably just stick with JSON for a very long time. And also the second reason is that basically any language under the sun that is half decent has either inbuilt support for JSON, that includes JavaScript obviously, but things like Python, PHP, tons of other languages, or they have a third-party library that is fairly good and will parse the JSON. The inbuilt support probably won't be addressed anytime soon, but as long as you can get JavaScript support, you can get PHP support, and you can get ASP, or you can get C# support, at least a third-party library, then I think that there is an ability for Internet Object to actually get some traction. So I think that this is a really good direction for web development to go towards. So I haven't done the video yet, but I did plan to do a video on why TypeScript is just infinitely superior to JavaScript, and basically why I think it should become effectively the de facto standard for doing web development. We should just pretty much do away with general developers working with JavaScript and just have everyone working with TypeScript. Because one of the biggest issues with JavaScript that Internet Object addresses and TypeScript addresses is the fact that in JavaScript, you never actually know if an object has a key that you need it to have, or if it has a function that you need it to have. And this is because of the fact that JavaScript just is not a strongly typed language. But when you work with things like TypeScript that actually have proper typing, that do type checking, it makes it a lot easier because you're going to be checking this stuff anyway. So instead of forcing the developer to worry about checking this stuff that you're going to be checking, you might as well have the compiler doing it. And that, I think, is one of the benefits that comes along with using Internet Object. You don't need to have the developer working on things that every developer is going to have to check anyway. If you can push that out of the realms of the developer's concerns and move it to the parser or move it to the compiler, where it's just going to affect every developer and they can worry about actually solving proper problems rather than this basic mechanical stuff that should be solved somewhere else, it will save a lot of time and it will save a lot of money for basically every developer. So even though the Internet Object was designed for the use with the internet, I do think it also serves a purpose off of the internet on Linux and macOS systems and other Unix-like systems, obviously. And that is for config files. So I don't see them very often, but occasionally you will run into config files that are written in JSON. They're not bad, but some of them are a bit hard to work with, and it might be an improvement to actually move towards Internet Object for those. Obviously, it would be up to those developers whether they want to do that or whether they want to stick with JSON. I do think that having more options available for the formats that configs can be in is quite helpful for the developers. It may not be as helpful for the users because they have to learn a bunch of different formats to work with, but I do think that ultimately it's for the best of the software. So if we go back to the web page, if you are interested in actually finding out more about this, you can come and read the story on here about how Internet Object came into being and how the developer actually conceived of it. And also you can go to their mailing list and check out their Twitter account and also the developer's Twitter account if you're interested. So mainly because of the library support issue, I'm not expecting JSON to be replaced anytime soon. Even then, I do expect it to pretty much stick around until we stop using JavaScript on the web, just because of how simple it is to work with that language. I do think that when that library support issue is addressed, we might start seeing Internet Object popping up more often. So maybe it's a good idea to learn Internet Object and just keep the syntax in the back of your head, and if it ever ends up replacing JSON, then it ends up replacing JSON. Or if it just becomes a tiny bit of the market and there's just a few projects working with it, you still may come across it one day. So maybe it's a good idea to just know how it works and at least keep an eye on it. Because no one would have thought that XML was going to get replaced when that was the de facto standard. So maybe no one's going to know that JSON's going to get replaced one day. So who knows? So if you like this video, remember to smash that like button and leave me a comment down below letting me know what you think. If you want to see more videos like this, remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below. And I don't know, maybe one day we'll all be using Internet Object instead of JSON. I don't know, could happen. Could definitely happen, that's for sure. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.